Concurrent session 3.2, Flashpoints in Asia, will now begin. This session will be moderated by Dr. Tuyeon Kim from the Center for New American Security. Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to this very, I was going to say exciting, but very concerning and perhaps even sobering session, but we will hopefully end on a positive note. You have the description of this session, so I will not go into great lengths to set it up. We're here to talk about two flashpoints in Asia. One is the Taiwan Strait, and the other is the South China Sea. And today we have an excellent panel of speakers. To my immediate left, we have Professor Jimbo Ken, who is the Professor of International Relations at Keio University and a Managing Director of Programs at the International House of Japan. To his right, we've got Ellen Kim, who is the Deputy Director of the Korea Chair and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. To her left, we've got Patricia Kim, who is a Fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center and a Fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. To her left, we've got Kim Young-ho, who is the Vice President and Professor at Korea National Defense University. And last but not least, we've got Wang Junsheng, who's a Director and Professor at the Department of China's Regional Security at the National Institute of International Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Let's take a really brief survey down the row, and I'd like to ask each and every one of you, what is one potential pathway or a pathway to a potential conflict that you find most concerning or most likely in the Taiwan Strait? We'll start with you, Professor Jimbo.
Sure. As a first speaker, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I mean, I think there have been two major pathways, which is the conflict of necessity and the conflict of opportunity or choices that a concerned party could make. The necessity lies in the basic Chinese principle. It's understanding about the free communique between China and the United States, and the Chinese version of the One China principle. And according to the anti-secession law, if Taiwan declared independence and creating the conditions that the Taiwan become such kind of independent entity, that China is, the necessitate itself to take the forceful action against Taiwan. That's one first category. But I think that many of those devils in the detail lies in the, I think, a reality of the opportunity itself. That could be the growing gap of the balance of power over the Taiwan Straits, which may create the window of opportunity for China to take action. The forceful action against Taiwan, or there will be a kind of emerging recognition that United States may not come in to help Taiwanese defense. And that really creates a kind of the failure of the deterrence movement, which may create the strategic calculation for China to get that kind of action as well. So those are the two major categories that will make the pathway towards the conflict in Taiwan.
Okay, Dr. Ellen Kim.
Thank you. So basically, I think there are three conditions under which China will use force against Taiwan. One is when Taiwan declares independence. The other is the U.S. when U.S. is moving away from one China policy and recognize Taiwan as an independent and sovereign state. And third one is when China loses confidence that there's no other way but to use force to achieve unification. But at the moment, I do not see that any of these are likely to happen. What I'm worried about the Taiwan Strait is the condition of possibility of dual contingency in the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. That is when U.S. is preoccupied or distracted by a possible Taiwan Strait conflict, North Korea might have an incentive to attack Korea. And similarly, if there is a conflict on the peninsula, then China might have an incentive to invade Taiwan, to divide the U.S. forces, and also to create a dilemma for Washington.
Okay, Dr. Patricia Kim.
Thank you, Tuyeon. I just want to thank the ASEAN Institute for inviting me to this panel. I see broadly three pathways to conflict. The first is military action taken by China if Taiwan were to declare independence. The second is forceful unification by China, triggered by an assessment in Beijing that China has the capabilities to do this and that the benefits would outweigh the costs of engaging in such actions. And then a third is a conflict triggered by an unintended clash or escalation in the Taiwan Strait between PLA and Taiwanese forces, or the forces of Taiwan's friends, like the United States or its allies. I think the first of these two scenarios are looking increasingly unlikely in the near to medium-term future. I think in Taiwan, there's not much support for outright declaring independence. 80% of Taiwanese prefer the status quo. And the second scenario, I think, of where China sort of gains this confidence that it could take Taiwan and not suffer devastating consequences is also very unlikely. I think if there's anything that the world has learned, and I'm sure the leadership in Beijing has learned from the conflict in Ukraine, is that military superiority is no guarantee of success in a war. And so that has to be sobering for them. And I think if China were to invade Taiwan or to carry out forcible unification, this would trigger a decoupling, a complete decoupling, not just economically, but diplomatically, politically, between the United States and China and the Western world, which is exactly what Beijing doesn't want at this point. And so I just see that as unlikely. And so I think the most likely scenario, from my perspective, is an accidental conflict that's, again, triggered by the forces of the PLA in Taiwan or the US and others that are active in this region, where there's a clash and it becomes difficult for leaders for domestic political reasons or for reputational reasons to back away. And so we find these countries at odds and at war.
Thank you. Professor Kim.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, I'm completely agree with what just Patricia Kim said. I think that the most likely scenario would be the kind of the unintended and inadvertent kind of escalation of the military confrontations between the United States and the Chinese navies. Other than that, I think that if still it happens, I can specifically point out the leader of China, Xi Jinping's political calculation related to extension of his leadership term. In other words, when President Xi wants or needs to demonstrate some kind of tangible achievement for his legacy or his leadership, he can initiate some kind of aggressive behavior. So, but still, I think it still can be difficult to need some more time, because the success of such military actions cannot be guaranteed. So, and if it fails, it will lead to the Xi's kind of loss of power. So I think the general chance for the Xi to take such a risky action or move would not be so high.
Thank you. Professor Wang.
Actually, my main viewpoint is the current peninsula situation is very dangerous. The way we work out from this dilemma is we should have international cooperation. In order to get the international cooperation, we should respect each other country's core interest. As for your question, I think it's the last scenario that China want to see. There any conflict that happened in Taiwan issue or in South China Sea issue. But I think if we see the most likely scenario, if we can imagine the conflict happened, I think maybe there are maybe two possible pathways. One is just like Mr. Kim mentioned earlier, maybe Taiwan announced independence. Maybe some of them think, okay, the time is in the mainland side, according to the mainland development. Also maybe they think, okay, their independent activity may get U.S. support. Another scenario is some Chinese scholars think maybe some U.S. people maybe want to copy what happened in Ukraine now. maybe try to entrap China into a war. It seems like South China Sea issue and Taiwan issue is a very good place. Maybe try to entrap China, let China feel more and more room to dialogue, to use dialogue to, use dialogue to resolve this issue. So I think the part we most worry about is what U.S. really want. But I think, yeah, from Chinese side, we definitely do not want any conflict happen. Yeah.
You know, some of your colleagues on the panel have stressed the likelihood of accidental conflict or inadvertent conflict, whether it's based on a miscalculation or misperception. So, Professor Wang, what is your reaction to that? Is there a likelihood of accidental or inadvertent conflict, and what scenario would that look like?
I think for the accidental, especially maybe in the South China Sea, yeah, the one reason.
Well, let's stick with Taiwan straight
Taiwan.
for now.
Taiwan, yeah, I do not think it's a very, very most likely scenario. Yeah, for the accidental happen, I think maybe the precondition is China and the US. I think we have our bottom of the line. We have some kind of mechanism to negotiate. So for Taiwan issue, accidental, I do not think maybe such kind of scenario will happen. Yeah, in the near future, especially.
Mm-hmm. Let's take another brief survey. You know, I think it'd be helpful to see if our colleagues agree or perhaps have a slightly different view on these issues. Let's move on to the South China Sea. And of course, we can probably could spend a whole session on each of these flashpoints. But the same question, Professor Jimbo, is what pathway to potential conflict do you see in the South China Sea that concerns you the most or is the most likely?
Sure. Comparing between Taiwan Strait and also the South China Sea, I'm beginning to feel that there will be a more conflict potential in the South China Sea than in the Taiwan Strait. But I think the scale and the escalation dynamics is so different between each other. Mm-hmm. First, I think reason is there is, again, that the growing gap in the balance of power between the concerned states, especially between China and the Philippines. And secondly, comparing with other flashpoints that we can think about, there hasn't been a sophisticated understanding of how the escalation could be managed. So that's on the Chinese side and also on the Philippine side. But the capability has been growing on the both sides. So they don't know how they can define their own kind of safety danger kind of dynamics. And then once that the crisis starts, I don't think there has been the understanding of how to, control the escalation. So, and then if that kind of, the asymmetry will be growing, there will be the cases that the one party will leverage to take advantage of such kind of, the growing gap between the sides, and then allowing, especially from the China, to I think expanding its own kind of status quo management on the other side, so that you've already have a phase one, which is the completion of all the artificial islands to be militarized, and then the phase two would be something to utilize in a much more materialized manner. And if Philippines or US will take a red line on those kind of action, and that will be the way that they can actually have a potential conflict might emerge.
Hmm. Dr. Ellen Kim. We've got 4 Dr. Kims on this panel, so I'm going to specify with first and last name for our 2 colleagues in the middle. Dr. Ellen Kim.
So in the South China Sea, basically President Biden and US government officials made it very clear repeatedly that any attack on Philippines vessels or air carrier and armed forces in South China Sea could invoke US-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. That actually sends a very clear assurance message to Philippines and also strong deterrence message to China, I think. But as China is actually increasingly using gray zone tactics and intimidations to disrupt Philippines' resupply missions, in the second Thomas Shaw. So I think that there is a highly likelihood of accidents or miscalculation that could actually increase the real risk of an armed conflict that could entrap the United States.
Dr. Patricia Kim.
Thank you. So I think the South China Sea is different in the sense that this is a dispute over uninhabited islands. It's a little bit different because we don't have a living democracy of 23.5 million people who are sort of in the crosshairs of this conflict. Having said that, in the South China Sea, China and other Southeast Asian claimants have been jostling for access to these uninhabited islands, features, strategic waterways, to the resources that exist there for decades. And I think here the most likely scenario for conflict, and I agree with my previous panelists, is that, that China and its rival claimants in their daily interactions between their coast guards, their navies, their fishermen, and their militia could find themselves in a deadly confrontation that becomes very challenging for either side to back down. Ellen mentioned the Biden administration's statement about where exactly the U.S.-Philippine defense commitment applies to. He basically said that all Philippine public vessels, Coast Guard vessels, and personnel are covered by the U.S. Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, this is definitely a signal to China. It's a sign of reassurance to the Philippines, but I also think it puts the U.S. in a tricky situation where if the Biden administration or whoever is in power, if there is an escalation, we'll be having to think, is this a serious enough escalation for the United States to get involved? And so there's going to be a lot of thought that needs to be put into there, and I worry about the situation that we find ourselves in. In terms of what my previous panelists talked about, sort of is Taiwan or South China Sea the more likely area for conflict, I would agree. I think the Taiwan Strait, because the conflict there is taken much more seriously, and there's just a lot more concern, there's a lot more policy around this area, and so I think there's a tendency for both sides, or all sides, the US, China, Taiwan, to tread very carefully and treat it delicately. Whereas in the South China Sea, we're talking about uninhabited features, and so I think sort of the restraint comes down, and therefore the potential for unintended clashes go up, and so it is certainly an area of concern.
And some experts argue that because of the massive body of water, it's harder to escalate into full-scale war because of the amount of water and terrain that needs to be covered. But let's move on to Professor Kim Young-ho. In the South China Sea, a potential or a pathway to potential conflict that you see that is either most concerning or most likely in the South China Sea?
I think that actually, since more stakeholders, more countries involved in the South China Sea area, more frictions and disputes can be occur. But the actual kind of violent militarized clashes in the South China Sea are more unlikely than in the Taiwan Strait. That's my thought. But still, if such a violent crash occurs in the South China Sea, again, it would be a result of an inadvertent escalation, mainly between China and Philippines or China and Vietnam, I think. But considering the fact that China must appraise not just action of the an immediate disputing party, but also the reactions of all other, the Asian countries in the region. So it makes the Chinese calculation more complicated. So I think that the occasions of heightened military tensions or frictions or disputes would occur from time to time or even more frequently. But still, the actual all-out militarized conflict or more serious conflict, the possibility will be actually lower.
Professor Wang.
I think do not like the Taiwan issue, mainly, between China and the US for South China Sea issue. I think the biggest maybe threat is miscalculation. Yeah, because it involved in so many players. In some times, it's very difficult to understand, to know the true intention of another parties. Yeah, such as the current situation in South China Sea, what the Philippines is doing, I think is very, very dangerous. Yeah, from Chinese side, is Philippines push China into the corner. Yeah, actually China do not want to have any conflict with the Philippines. So the intention behind the Philippines or behind the US, yeah, sometimes it's very difficult for China to know very, very clearly. Maybe the second pathway, I think, is accident. Because as we know in South China Sea, US and China, since the end of the Cold War, yeah, accident happened several times. US used the excuse of the free of navigation in the area very frequently, even the military drill. So we can say if any accident happened in this area, both nationalism are very, very high, not only in US but also in China. Maybe it's very difficult for two countries to make a concession. So I think maybe the mostly worry about is the accident. So I think China and the US, we should have some mechanism to manage such kind of crisis. Yeah.
I want to stay with you, Professor Wang. There have been several near misses in the South China Sea, but they've never escalated. Why do you think that's so?
Yeah, I think from Chinese side, just like I mentioned earlier, I think it's the last scenario that China want to have the conflict with any players. So China try to keep calm. Yeah, when any intensive situation happen or accident happen, I think China, the first reaction from China is try to make the true attention of another players, try to contact with another players. We try to, let the situation to be resolved through the peaceful ways. Yeah.
I'd like to bring in Dr. Patricia Kim and stay with you, Professor Wang. Let's talk about implications and consequences and start macro. If you can very briefly share with the audience, what are the global implications and consequences, both on the security front, but also on the economic and business and trade front, for a conflict or crisis in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait?
So I think, again, these are two kind of different problem sets. And I think the exact implications would depend on how conflict broke out, who is seen as the aggressor versus the victim. It could be that it's very clear or that it's not, and it's not so clean cut. I think, again, a crisis in the Taiwan Strait would be much more serious. It would have the potential for greater escalation because if there's one issue that riles up China, it's Taiwan. And also for the United States, this is one issue where the US has made very clear through the Taiwan Relations Act and through our longstanding ties with Taiwan that the United States has a strong interest in peace and stability in the waterways, and that it will not abide by a coercive attempt by China to change the status quo. And so I think if there were to be a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, this would again trigger the kind of decoupling that we've been trying to avoid, that I think both the US and China have been trying to avoid in terms economically, diplomatically. I think this would be the same case for many Western countries, European countries, probably Japan and South Korea as well, who would have to rethink their ties, their entire ties, and how they view China. And so this would have, huge consequences. And of course, the stakes are highest for the people of Taiwan, where literally their lives are at stake, their way of life is at stake. In terms of the South China Sea, I think, again, the implications are also, it would depend on how the conflict plays out. There isn't always a clear aggressor here. There's an action-reaction dynamic. There's a lot of blame gaming where, the Chinese viewpoint is that the Philippines is sort of provoking China, is going back on its word, Whereas I think the view in the Philippines or elsewhere is that it's the other way around, that it's China's aggressive positioning in the South China Sea, especially over the last 2 decades, that has actually brought the United States closer into the region, that has sort of increased the demand signal for the United States to be involved, to have closer ties with the Philippines, for there to be closer ties among US allies and friends in the regions, not just with the US bilaterally, but amongst themselves and trilaterally and unilaterally, as we've talked about earlier today. And so there's a lot at stake here, and I think, again, it would sort of depend on exactly how the conflict played out.
Yeah. Professor Wang.
Yeah, actually, I'm not the specialist about the Taiwan issue and also the China Sea issue. Yeah, I'm specialized for the Korea Peninsula issue. So previously, I'm prepared for the try to tell the audience about the linkage between Korea Peninsula issue and with the Taiwan issue and so the China Sea issue. But my point is there are no any relations. So I think totally different. I mean, as for your question, international original consequence, I think this is very different 2 issues. For Taiwan issue is, belong to China's domestic affairs. But for Korea Peninsula issue, we know, it involved into independent countries. For South China Sea issue, as we know, this issue is a problem between China and some of the Southeast Asia countries. But for Korea Peninsula issue, this is the main problem between DPRK and the US. Maybe the only, the common between them is China hopes peaceful resolution. Just like we mentioned, I mentioned earlier, for Taiwan issue and also the China Sea issue, I think China's policy is very, very clear. We want to use peaceful, no matter what kind of time, how long. I think China can wait. Can wait the opportunity is right. For Korea Peninsula issue, also, China speak very, very clearly. We have the 3 principles. One of them is peaceful resolution. So, as you mentioned, maybe the consequence implication, I do not think there are maybe direct relations between them. Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue to my next question. I'd like to bring in Professor Kim Young-oh and Dr. Ellen Kim and Professor Jimbo, and let's narrow the aperture a little bit. What are the implications and consequences for South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and for Japan, should there be a crisis in the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea? Because these are not, issues or crises in just a certain part or one sub-part of the region. They really do have global implications. But what are the implications and consequences for the Korean Peninsula and for Japan? Let's start with Professor Kim.
Okay, I think so. Of course, such a conflict will have very big and serious implications for South Korean security, particularly more by a case in the Taiwan Strait, I think. More concretely, there can be 4 scenarios in which South Korea would voluntarily or involuntarily involve a militarized dispute due to such a clash in Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. First, I think that it is a case when China instigates North Korea to provoke South Korea militarily in order to distract the U.S. engagement to the Taiwan contingencies or South China Sea contingencies. Second, it is possible for North Korea to see it as a chance to unify the whole Korean Peninsula and invade us based on an expectation of the kind of limited U.S. military assistance to South Korea. Third, China can contain the Yellow Sea militarily to keep the South Korean military from assisting Taiwan or other countries in conflict with China. Fourth, even though it is a lower possibility due to its extreme aggressiveness, China can bomb or launch missiles at the U.S. bases in South Korea to block or weaken the U.S. military assistance to Taiwan or other countries in dispute. So, and as to the reasons for less discussion, I mean, you didn't answer here, but okay. Actually, we are not talking about much in South Korea about this kind of conflict. I think that the reason for that is maybe the first, as I mentioned earlier, just before, when it happens, South Koreans think its influence would be very indirect rather than direct. And second, it's basically, I'm sorry, and the first actually that generally we think that the possibility of that kind of militarized dispute will be very low. And the second is, it happens still, its influence is indirect. Third, although it's very minority view in our South Korea, some South Koreans worry about the discussion itself, about those kind of classes, and our role of assisting those, China, or Taiwan, or countries in conflict with China may irritate Chinese Chinese government. So they think we must not to do it. So that's why the reason for not discussing so much in South Korea, I think. Yeah.
Perfect. You answered my next question. Let's go to Dr. Ellen Kim.
So both South China Sea and Taiwan Strait definitely have a huge implication for Korea. First of all, one of the reasons is that both South China Sea and Taiwan Strait is South Korea's main commercial trade and energy import routes. More than 90% of the South Korea's trade volume actually go through these two waters. And also nearly 80% of South Korea's energy import actually go through Taiwan Strait. So there's a huge economic implication if there is a conflict in those two waters. There is also a high possibility that conflict in those two flashpoints could actually spill over to neighboring countries. In South Korea, there is a huge concern of entrapment in the case that U.S. calls upon South Korea for assistance. And also, Korean policymakers are worried that the use of USFK for Taiwan contingency could weaken the deterrence posture in the Korean Peninsula. And lastly, as Professor Kim mentioned, that a possibility of contingency in the Taiwan and Korean Peninsula really underscores that Taiwan Strait is actually close and no longer a remote issue from Korea.
Professor Jimbo.
As the late Prime Minister Abe once mentioned that the Taiwan contingency is the contingency of Japan, which made Chinese government media people very furious about this statement. And I think that reflects the geographical reality where Taiwan is located, which is only 100-something kilometers away from the southwestern end of the Japanese Yonaguni Islands. If there is a full-scale war might happen, the Japanese theater will be inevitably involved, and that's the concept of the defense for Japan. So there has been an increasing shared sense among the Japanese policymaker that there has been an indivisibility of the theater taking place in Taiwan, plus how Japan will be involved. So there will be a little chance for Japan to take a step away from the contingency. That is the growing notion that we have. And secondly, if there was 10 years ago, we were talking about Japan-China potential conflict over Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And then that's a kind of incremental salami slicing kind of gray zone management, and that was important. But now we're talking about Taiwan, which is a much more high-scale, high-end type of the conflict escalatory scenario, and which has become the center of our attention about the realignment of our U.S.-Japan alliance. Japan has decided to double the size of defense budget, and decided to procure the defense equipment, which does involve the long-range strike capability. That will really, change the role capabilities and mission sharing with the United States. So that really comes into the picture that the center of the strategic attention is now paid to the Taiwan scenario for Japan. That's number one. And for South China Sea, I think there also has been a growing awareness that the South China Sea and East China Seas are all connected with the reality of the sea lanes of communication for the Japanese economic activities, but at the same time that how rule-based maritime order could be maintained in the South China Sea does reflect upon the future of how the rule-based order can be materialized in the East China Sea. So that is our concern. And then that also trigger us to commit more to the maritime capability development on the side of the Philippines, especially through the provision of the Coast Guard cutter vessels to the Filipino Coast Guards. We provide a constant training on them with the belief that there should be, again, that there should be some sophisticated escalation management could be materialized with the notion that there should be the ladder on the escalation, which you should not climb up, which is that keep the tensions and the conflict within the realm of the the policing and the law enforcement, and that is something that the Filipino needs to build its own capability, which is, I think, from Tokyo's perspective, contributes to the escalation management in the South China Sea.
So we've heard a couple of our panelists talk about the concern in South Korea of U.S. forces being mobilized and deployed to either the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea in the event of an incident if the United States requests this. So let me first turn to Dr. Patricia Kim and Dr. Ellen Kim. Would or should the United States invoke its mutual defense treaty with South Korea? Of course, it really depends on the scenario, but if it's needed, would or should the United States invoke it? And what kind of assistance should the United States request from South Korea, the South Korean military?
So let me put it this way. In the event of conflict or crisis, South Korea will be forced to make a strategic choice between the United States and China. And of course, understandably, South Korea doesn't want to do that because South Korea will stand at the forefront facing threats coming from both China and North Korea at the same time. But I think that, but if South Korea actually openly refuses to fulfill its alliance treaty obligations, in Washington, that really hurts South Korea's credibility as a reliable ally, and I think that we need to manage that. So for that, I think that there could be some smart ways for South Korea to approach these issues. And I think that South Korea should and Washington have a quiet conversation about the different conflict scenarios. And if South China attacks South Korea directly, then I think that it will be difficult for South Korea to stay out. But in other scenario where there is a limited attack on Taiwan or China engaged in low-intensity provocations, then I think that South Korea and the United States could talk about the division of labor, where South Korea do not militarily intervene in Taiwan Strait, but also focus on deterring North Korea's opportunistic aggression, and also provide other assistance such as non-combatant evacuation operation or ISR or rare air support.
Thank you.
Well, I think Ellen put a lot of great points on the table, so I'll just be brief. I don't think there's anything in the U.S.-ROC Mutual Defense Treaty that obligates South Korea to come to the United States defense to defend another ally of the U.S. And so there's a bit of a hoop there. But having said that, I think South Korea has always fought alongside the United States in major wars, and it has shown up as a good ally. And so I would imagine that South Korea would have some role to play in some sort of military contingency, but as Ellen said, what that role would be, there could be many different pathways. I think South Korea has really been showing up more on sort of speaking up to say that it has an interest in the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. It has an interest in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and the broader Indo-Pacific. And I think those are all good signs. I think it's important for all of US allies, and not just allies actually, just anyone who lives in the Indo-Pacific to make that clear. so that we know that these are waterways that everybody depends on for their maritime trade, for their oil and their gas. And so it's important that we don't have conflict here. And so I think those are the ways that South Korea is already contributing. And I'm sure if we were to, hopefully we don't get to that point, but if we did, I can't imagine a scenario where South Korea would not play any kind of role.
Professor Kim, as a South Korean representative on this panel, what should South Korea do, or what would and what should South Korea do, both questions, in the event that the United States did invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty? And this is a topic that really is still quite sensitive, and even the United States and South Korea, that the two allies have had a challenging time even discussing this topic of, first, what would the United States forces Korea do in any of these situations, but also second, what would and should South Korea do?
I think it's, regardless of being asked or requested by United States or not, I think as the closest ally to United States, as well as in accordance to our recently announced our commitment to increase our role for the peace and stability in this region, I think we must do something about this kind of conflict. Besides, as Ellen Kim and Patricia Kim mentioned, the importance of economic importance in this area. I mean, the sea lane communication, blah and blah. And so I think we have to do something about it. But problem is, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, our effort can be limited. There can be three, as I mentioned earlier, because it's as already mentioned by both our panelists here. First, that's emboldened the North Korean opportunistic attack on us, China's instigation of North Korean military, and China's preventive military action toward us, or the USFK. So those kind of possibilities actually limited our actual role. But I think that, having said that, I think we can do something like a logistic role, or some kind of medical support or humanitarian assistance. So we can provide those kind of assistance or some kind of military kind of provision. But other than that, beyond that, I mean, it depends on the level of actually kind of conflict, I think. Yeah.
Let's move on to talking about so what? Now what? How can we reduce risk? How can we manage conflict? And this reminds me of a quote by Robert McNamara in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he said, "No longer any such thing as strategy, only crisis management." So let's talk about, is there any political appetite by the key players for, first, reducing risk and eventually getting on a path towards resolving these two flashpoints diplomatically? We've seen in history efforts, but diplomatic efforts have proven to be challenging. So let's start with Dr. Patricia Kim and Professor Wang.
Great, well, thank you, Tuyeon. I think compared to 2 years ago, I would say, especially in the Taiwan Strait, we are in a much better, more stable place. China and the United States have taken steps to stabilize the relationship, both for their separate reasons. For the United States, there's a lot going on. There's a lot on the United States' plate with the war in Ukraine, with the war in Israel and Gaza, with various political division and societal issues that we're facing at home. In China, there are also grave domestic economic headwinds. China's struggling with record high youth unemployment, with the implosion of the real estate sector, these efforts to sort of roll back de-risking efforts by the United States and Europe and others. And so there's a lot on both countries' plates. And so I think that's why we've seen this effort to stabilize relations. Military to military channels are back open between the two countries. So the two militaries are communicating, there's working group level communication. There's also leader to leader level communication between Biden and Xi. And I think all of these efforts have been very good for stabilizing the relationship. Now, how long does this last? That's sort of the key question. I do worry that the United States and China, are committed to stabilization in this short term. But I do see very big differences in how the two countries sort of think about the strategic framing for their relationship. For the United States, the US government has said very clearly that it wants to compete, cooperate, and when necessary, confront China. Whereas China has rejected this framing and said, we can only do one or the other. We can only compete or cooperate. And there's a tendency, I think, in China to see military-to-military communications as sort of a US request that China is going along with. And I just don't think that's a sustainable way for China to look at this. And I worry that when we hit rough patches in the relationship, as we already have and as we will, that China will pull back from these very communications channels exactly when we need them. And so I guess what I'm saying is they're working now, these channels are working now, stabilization is here for now, but I think it's a question mark on how long it lasts.
And that's a good point, because they work until they don't. And it's not just China that does this. There's a culture in Northeast Asia of not picking up the phone if you don't want to, right? If you're in a diplomatically tense relationship with whichever counterpart in Northeast Asia. South Korea is to blame for this too. Even Japan is to blame for this, and North Korea especially in this region. But let's turn to Professor Wang. Any political appetite by the key players to try to reduce risk or even try to embark on a path towards resolution of these two flashpoints? And what can the United States and or China do together and separately?
I agree with Mr. Kim just mentioned. I think now China and the U.S. Try our best to stabilize our relationship. I think we should have more dialogue, crisis management, even the contingency plan. So I think we should follow this trend. But I noticed maybe the most dangerous change in South China Sea or Taiwan issue is following the competitive relationship between China and the U.S. It is intensifying. Just as we know, I think U.S. Maybe use these issues to compete China. I find another change in Korea Peninsula issues. As we know, since the end of the Cold War, U.S. always have the two parallel aims in Korean Peninsula issues. One is denuclearization. Another one is military deployment. According to my analysis, in previous U.S., denuclearization is the first. Then maybe to deploy more strategic assets. But now I think, especially since Biden took office, I think now is to deploy more strategic assets firstly, then to maybe to denuclearize. So following this change, we can see even the trilateral de facto alliance, military alliance, almost created. So I think maybe for Taiwan issue, for South China Sea issue, U.S. always maybe use such kind of issue try to compete with China. But also, I think we should notice, even in Korea Peninsula, maybe U.S. policy is still changing. So what shall we do? I think for U.S. and for China, we should have more dialogue. Actually, we have many overlapping interests, and not only in South China Sea, in Taiwan issue, stabilize, also in Korea Peninsula issues. What we see now is North Korea's missile test cannot be stopped. This is what's happening today. And also, I think for South Korea, for another players, you also have your role to play. I think try to bring China and the U.S. together, not only to choose sides. We stand with, such as with South Korea stand with U.S. to compete with China. No, I do not think it's in your interest. Maybe the best way is try to bring U.S. and China together. I think without the cooperation, substantial cooperation with China and the U.S., not only the Taiwan issue, South China issue cannot be resolved according to our willing. Even the Korea Peninsula, I think the situation will be more dangerous.
Last question before we turn it over to the audience. Let's bring in South Korean and Japanese perspectives on this. Are there any specific measures that you would like to see the United States, China, and key players in Southeast Asia take to reduce risk and embark on a path towards one day resolving these flashpoints? And is there a role that South Korea and Japan can play in helping these efforts? And what could that be? Professor Jimbo.
Oh, yeah. Our panel so far, sounds like we have more agreement and consensus rather than the differences, and which makes me a bit worried that wonder whether we are missing something about identification of the issue. So let me conclude my remark by raising some of the devil's advocate on this. I worry about what Mike Green this morning mentioned about the end state of the US-China strategic competition. So there's so many ranges. And if for example, Matt Pottinger Gallagher says winning the competition, if such kind of win is the kind of the US objectives in dealing with the competition, there will be a danger that the China may not really abide by in making such kind of US-China contact as a way to de-escalate the tension, because there's no reason for backing up if the United States try to win the competition. So that could be one of the dangerous dynamics that they have. And second is about the misunderstanding, or who actually knows about the Shanghai Communique, 6 assurances. And then if China thinks that this is the principle, you violate it, who in the Congress can actually trace that kind of understanding which has been there among those elites in the US-China, diplomats? And now it's a very much wider spectrum of conflict that they are playing, but there's no such kind of rule of the game, how you can really manage the issue. And so that I think that it needs to generalize how you can really manage the US-China tension. We are not to the formula yet. That's number 2. And the third concern that we have is a mutual underestimation of the consequences. We can occupy that. We can, escalate the situation, and then sometimes that unintentionally cross the red line of each side without understanding of each other. So these are the 3 sets of the concern that I have. And then what we need probably is the clear understanding of how the deterrence may work, and how much that the political assurance that we can really give to each other, that make sure that the peaceful resolution is always possible in the case of the escalating of tension.
Thank you. Final word, Professor Kim.
Okay. I think that as Jimbo said, I mean that the more we talk, I think the more actually concerned about the situation, and the more we realize the differences among us. I mean, especially the Chinese colleague here. So I think it's something like typical mirror image or a situation or some kind of it's a security dilemma. I mean, so I think that first of all we need to kind of encourage, establish some kind of mechanism for the confidence building measure. I think that should be the first task we should work on more, not just bilaterally or trilaterally. And not just bilaterally, but trilaterally or multilaterally in the whole region. And second, I mean, that's about the cooperation, or our preparation between our South Korea and United States. I think we must, given the combined arrangement of our military cooperation, I think that South Korea and the United States must start discuss more detailed action plans. What should we do in these kind of contingencies? The discussions must include not just not only just the South Korean military and USFK's roles in assisting Taiwan or the other disputing countries, but also how to defend against possible North Korean provocation or the Chinese preventive military actions. And third, I think that's trilaterally with our United States and Japan. We also can start to talk about some kind of division of labor among 3 of us. What should we do in this kind of contingencies? And how can we actually kind of, and also before that, we must kind of coordinate or evaluate our threat perception first. I mean, there are some kind of discrepancies among us. I mean, about the Chinese threat, North Korean threat. I mean, so we have to think about. I mean, discuss more about our, and kind of to align our threat perceptions, and then go forward to discuss about our division of labor. What should we do? That's it. Thank you.
No, and to add to that point, a very astute point. We've heard our panelists talk about the likelihood or or not of potential conflict arising on these two flashpoints. But if I take Professor Kim's point a little bit one step further, something that I've been suggesting, which is still very sensitive politically, is the need for the United States, South Korea, and Japanese militaries to practice various contingency scenarios together. Of course, you should not name it, Operation Taiwan Strait or Operation South China Sea, but still there is a need, a practical reality is that there is a need to be prepared just in case some type of contingency happens. And of course, we've already established the fact that there could be a zillion scenarios and circumstances under which something could happen at these two flashpoints. So let's turn it over to audience questions. Please state your name, your affiliation, and a very brief question, please, here at the front. Gentleman at the front. 여기 앞에요. The very front.
I'm Jia Daojun. I'm from Peking University. I was quite puzzled by the excitement about the Taiwan question, because viewed in Beijing, the Pelosi visit was the climax. After that, there was a walk back in all quarters, Washington and Beijing, saying, should you go down that path, the next thing is to start firing. But why they pick up again? What is this? And secondly, the Philippine issue, as we see it in Beijing, is a continuation of the EPC-3 incident. When you had the US spy plane taking off from Okinawa to spy on China, of course, that was history. Today, Chinese capacity is better, not up to that yet. The Philippines is locking itself into being the second Cuba. It's allowing the US to have military bases. It's allowing the US to base its mid and long range, maybe even to tomorrow, never say never, long-range missiles targeting China. What are we really doing? And you are abstracting this to the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits. It's not a good idea, I would think. I'm not here to wreck your ball. I understand I'm a guest here. But for these sort of forums or conversations, we need some serious conversations.
Constructive debate is certainly welcome.
Yeah,
who would you like to pose that question to?
Now, my question is, what's the...
To who?
To everyone. What's the excitement?
Okay.
Don't we learn something?
Let's take one more question. Minister Kim right next to him.
Yes. Well, thank you. I really have kind of crisis management between two protagonists, US and China, can be established and can be workable for all of us. But that's my hope. This hope may be shared by everyone here. But my question is to Ellen and Patricia. While you're talking about South China Sea, you particularly mentioned about the Philippines in relation with the defense treatment, with United States. But in that area, there are many other countries like Vietnam and Indonesia who can be deeply involved if anything happens. So I really wanted to know, through your knowledge, what would be their stance for the time being for this issue, and how they can be involved, if anything happens. Okay? Thank you.
I could take a start. So Professor Jia, that's an interesting comment. I don't know if there's really excitement. I thought we were all saying that the situation is better. At least that was my point, that the situation has improved, that it was a low point 2 summers ago when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. And then we had the balloon incident where, that further dragged down the US-China relationship. And since then, there's been a steady effort initiated by the Biden administration, but on both sides to stabilize the relationship, and that's where we are today. And so I think, and also in Taiwan, I think there's a lot of, again, as I was saying at the beginning of the panel, there isn't much support for Taiwan independence. There's 80% of Taiwanese want to keep the status quo. China's very upset. They think that the new incoming president, William Lai, is an independence activist, so on and so forth. But he ultimately needs to pay attention to the political opinion in Taiwan, and they want the status quo. And so I think we're all kind of in the same place, and we're hoping that this can last, the stabilization can last. So I'm not really sure if we're excited or we're talking about war, but I think perhaps some of my other panelists and I as well agree that we do need to talk about contingencies, we need to be prepared, we need to strengthen all channels, whether it's between the US and its allies or also between the United States and China as well between its neighbors. And I think that that's happening with the CJK trilateral and other efforts. And so I think there's a lot of work being done here, but of course, that's now, right? And we have to see where this goes forward from there. And there's going to be a variety of dynamics at play with elections in the region, in the United States, and so on. In terms of other ASEAN or other Southeast Asian claimants, as you noted, there are a variety of views on how to handle the disputes in the South China Sea. If you look throughout history, there are times when certain countries are more sort of aggressive about making their claims, and there are other times where they sort of pull back and they prioritize their relationship with China. I think, right now, the Philippines, the view in China is that the United States is spurring the Philippines to take these actions, but that is not the view in the Philippines, that's not the view in the United States. And I think there's been a strong demand by not just the Philippines, but other Southeast Asian countries for the United States to be embedded and engaged in the region to help counterbalance this great power that China has become, this great military power that is taking these steps to assert what it says are its historical claims on these maritime features. So I think that's the reality. I don't know if that's overhyped, but hopefully that answers both of your questions.
Dr. Ellen Kim or any of other panelists would like to answer any of these two questions.
Okay, I think that nobody actually, as Patricia Kim said, it's my understanding that nobody here actually worry about or excited about actual occurrence, the actual possibility of occurrence of that kind of dispute. For myself, I said the general prospect for the occurrence of those kind of militarized conflict is low. That's what I said, I think. But while listening to what you just said, that's exactly what I'm concerned about. We are concerned about. I mean, as I mentioned, it's a kind of mirror image, right? You see, we see each other, kind of in different ways, even contrast way. But the problem is, remember why it started all. You just pointed to the EP3 incident, something like that. But how about reclamation of all those islands in the Southeast China Sea? So, I mean, its missiles there, as you mentioned, the bombers there, who we should blame first. So I mean, I think it's the feeling of your kind of feeling being pressured, being contained, or being watched, that's the source of the problem. So I mean, maybe both. It goes both ways. So that's why we talked about we need some kind of mechanism, not just establishing communication lines or channels, or some kind of a crisis management arrangement. Beyond that, I think we start to kind of actually interact more and try to some kind of find a mechanism for the competence buildings. That's why I said so. So I mean, but the attitude or perception or your approach to this problem can be problematic. So I mean, look back, both of us, each other. I mean, look back your side, look back our side, how we see the other side. That should be the first, I think, point we start to solve or deal with this problem, I think. Okay? Now, it's not just us. I think that we have to stop. Maybe I'm suddenly I'm too kind of
Excited?
peaceful thing. But anyway, so I mean, to stop thinking, so stop blaming the other side. That must be the first step we must take. I think that's all.
I mean, clearly building the mechanism is the actual exciting part of this entire conversation. Any other questions from the audience, please? Lady in the front, please, and then we'll go to the gentleman in the back.
Hello, I'm Yesun Kim. I'm a student at Ewha Women's University. I have a question for any panelist. What diplomatic role should South Korea play, as you've mentioned, to help prevent military escalation over Taiwan Strait? Would pursuing more regional cooperation, such as by aligning our Indo-Pacific strategy with Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision, even Taiwan's new southbound policy and India's look east policy be helpful, or would it be counterproductive given that Beijing could potentially object to these moves? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question.
Okay. I'm Suhao, a person from China from University. So I have the two questions. One to two Korean Americans, Mrs. King, and also one to our Japanese friends, Professor Kimball. Regarding the Taiwan issue, we know that look around the world, there's two nations had been divided since the World War II. That is Korean nation and Chinese nation, right? So regarding the division of the one nation, Chinese and Koreans, we could share strong empathies, regarding the mutual understanding, regarding of the, not only sufferings of the division of the one nation, but also the pursues the peaceful reunification. So my question to you that regarding the, both Korean and Chinese, we also have the strategic goal in the long term for the peaceful reunification. So from you two, any thinking about the mutual cooperation and the interaction between China and Korea regarding the peaceful reunification for both sides regarding the one nation's, reconciliation. So the second to my friends, in South China Sea, I remember some time ago I was in Philippines and I have interaction personally with some local people in Philippines. So we're talking about even the cooperation between China and Philippines. And even some local people like the Palawan's provincial governor talking about the energy cooperation with the Chinese, even over the South China Sea. So we know that at the moment we're talking too much about the contingencies or even crises in the South China Sea. But now China already has a strong economic presence in the in Philippines and Japan as well. So Japan now not only is of course, we know there's defense cooperation with Philippines, but also you also have the, financial and investment into the Philippines. And in China, we're discussing something like the 2+1. That means China and Japan to collaboration, engage in the Philippines regarding the Philippines' national resilience, economic resilience. So what's your comment about this way? Thank you.
Okay, should we start with both Dr. Kim's and then move on to Professor Jimbo?
I actually appreciate that you brought it up. I was gonna say that one of the reasons why South Korea was reluctant to talk about Taiwan issue is that South Korea, there are some people in Korea that, not some, but South Korea feel like South Korea needs, a lot of people actually think that South Korea needs Chinese cooperation for South Korea reunification, Korean Peninsula reunification. And because both China and Korea Peninsula remain divided after the Cold War, some see that both Korea and Chinese reunification are connected. However, I think that if you look at from Korean perspective about the way unification and the way we are situated with North Korea, we are facing a nuclear threat from North Korea, as opposed to China. You're not nuclear threatening Taiwan, but actually you are trying to coerce Taiwan to reunify it. So I think the situation is slightly different. So that's what I would just point out.
Dr. Patricia Kim?
So in terms of, as Ellen pointed out, there are many differences between the situation in the Korean Peninsula and between China and Taiwan. As As you mentioned, as we all know, the Taiwan issue is a result of the Chinese Civil War. There was a time for 2 decades when both sides claimed to be the legitimate China. But since Taiwan has democratized, there's increasingly a more sort of democratic identity there. There's a younger generation who doesn't necessarily see themselves as Chinese. And at the same time, China really hasn't helped its case either for peaceful reunification. China in the past has used a combination of carrots and sticks to try to peacefully reunify with Taiwan, but in recent years, it's increasingly turned to sticks, and I think this has further turned off many Taiwanese from wanting to even engage with the idea of one country, two systems. And so I think the homework is really China's to do about how to actually make peaceful reunification a reality. I think the US position, the current position, and which is the right one and which I don't believe should change, is that the United States supports any peaceful resolution of this conflict between China and Taiwan as long as force isn't used. That's the US policy. I think that's the smart place to be. And again, the homework is China's to do on how to achieve that outcome.
Professor Jimbo, and then anyone else who wants to answer the first question too.
Sure. First on the Dow Jones question about not on the excitement, but my interpretation on how things are going on. And I think that we are serious about creating a deterrent structure in Northeast Asia, and you face the geopolitical reality that China has its own strategic depth versus the maritime power advancing its nation, but very limited geolocations. Japan cannot bear all the kind of United States access that has to be shared with other nations, including Korea and the Philippines. And EDUCA is still underdeveloped. But if you see from the Google Earth, there's nothing around the EDUCA sites. But that has to be developed as the potential United States location site, which is very important for the diversification of the US forces when it's needed. And that's the geopolitical reality that we need to share with them. On the missiles, you find that, as you know, that the missile gap debates still exist. When you think about the high-end kind of escalation control that the missile comes in, that there is no INF range missiles from the US side. And then the US Army now develop its own, but where to locate them? This is a political reality that the maritime power that needs to have. So that needs to have a internal dynamics of the negotiation, what kind of a deterrent structure that we need to deal with it. And I think that needs to have Chinese understanding, sober understanding about how we try to craft such kind of structure. And the second, on the Indo-Pacific, we are grateful that President Yoon has initiated its own version of the Indo-Pacific strategy, which created lots of a common platform with Japan and all the others about how much we can really create the shared understanding about what kind of regional order to be pursued, and the connecting lots of the individual efforts that Japan and Korea are mutually pursuing, including the development aid, financial cooperation, many of the infrastructure developments, and that has been taking place. So that is a good sign, and then I hope this could be continued. And that really leads to the Suhao's connection that what Japan and China can do together. I think Japan and China is already doing together, especially on the ADB, AIIB types of the co-financing structure. We are learning from both sides, and especially on the involvement in the global south. And I hope that this kind of practices needs to be pursued further, including the not performing well third-party cooperation on the both sides, but we have potential to pursue that structure further. On the Philippines, yes, there's lots of commitments from China on the especially on the Luzon islands infrastructure projects. We are also doing the similar type of things. There should be some the projects that Japan and China can co-finance together, which could be a mutual benefits for both sides. So those are I think another reality that Japan and China is now embarking upon.
We have about 30 seconds left. Final word, Professor Wang and Professor Kim, 15 seconds each. Final word, very brief.
All yours, okay?
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, actually, my for South Korea's rule, Japan's rule, my final point is do not just follow U.S. to intervene Taiwan issue or South China Sea issue. Yeah, since Yun government, according to my analysis, South Korea government spoke Taiwan issue for 11 times. President Yun himself 7 times. So I think you should try to bring U.S. and China together for negotiation. I want to remember, my last sentence is, maybe we talk about the 2 flashpoints in Asia, but I think the most flashpoints maybe transforming into conflict in Asia is the Korea Peninsula. We talk about many times in China academic cycle, maybe following Ukraine crisis, Ukraine war, the war in the Middle East, maybe the next flashpoint is the Korea Peninsula. Because we can see the arms race is very increasing. And at the same time, there are no any efficient control, not only in 2 Koreas, but also in major powers.
And that's a good segue to the next session, which is another flashpoint in Asia, the Korean Peninsula. And I'm assuming that's in the plenary hall here. But please give us a round of applause to our brilliant speakers on this panel, a very timely and important topic today.